how I became an anti-Zionist Jew. This was my Facebook profile photo in 2007. I'm wrapped in tefillin, wearing a Free Palestine t-shirt, taking a bathroom selfie, and this was before selfies were a thing. That is just how avant-garde I was 14 years ago. But this video is not about bathroom selfies. It's about how I became an anti-Zionist Jew. And I want to be very clear about this. I did not grow up anti-Zionist, okay? I grew up super Zionist, Jewish Zionist day school, Jewish Zionist summer camp, Jewish Zionist youth group, Jewish Zionist synagogue, Jewish Zionist Sunday school, Jewish Zionist Tuesday school, Jewish Zionist youth group trip to Israel. We recited a prayer for the state of Israel in synagogue every Saturday. We celebrated Israeli Independence Day every May at my Jewish day school. Donations were collected for the Friends of the Israeli Defense Forces in synagogue. I supported Israel for the same reason I made a Passover Seder. In fact, we pray for a return to Jerusalem during the Passover Seder. Judaism and Israel were like peanut butter and jelly, or like Kara Swisher and Scott Galloway, or like Bibi Netanyahu and corruption, bribery, and breach of public trust. That is how intertwined and interlinked Judaism and Israel were during my upbringing. And so in 1948, after 2,000 years of exile, Jews finally made it home to Jerusalem. We did it. It was a miracle. Miraculously, 700,000 Palestinians disappeared. I'm just kidding. They didn't disappear. And I'm already getting ahead of myself here. But all of this is to say that I'm describing the narrative. So the turning point for me was when I spent a semester abroad. Guess where? In Jerusalem, living in my quote-unquote homeland. And this was going to be like the culmination of my being. I show up to the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, located on Har Tzofim, and I was like, yo, what's Arabic doing on all the street signs? And how come the falafel guy speaks Arabic? And how come the Arab falafel is better than the Jewish falafel? And oh, isn't it weird that Arabs also make falafel? And then I'm taking a Hebrew language class in Ulpan, and guess who's in my class? Palestinians from Jerusalem. Honestly, I was confused. I was like, you grew up in Jerusalem? Hannah, you're a Palestinian student in my Hebrew class? Born and raised in Jerusalem and you don't know Hebrew? I'm confused. And that sent me down a rabbit hole. And let me tell you a little something about Israel-Palestine history rabbit holes. They are the mother of all rabbit holes. And we obviously don't have time to get into any specific historical issues now. I've done deep dives on Israel-Palestine history in many other videos on this channel, so go check those out if you are interested. There is one thing, though, I do want to get across here in this video about Israel-Palestine history, which is to debunk this idea that the history is disputed. False. Historians agree on a lot. Historians agree about the cause of the Palestinian refugee crisis in 48, about why Palestinians weren't able to return to their homes. Namely, they were shot at when they tried to. These were primarily unarmed Palestinian cultivators, fallahin, who tried to return to their homes after the war. 10 to 15,000 of them tried to return every year between 1949 and 1954, and they were mercilessly shot at. And that's because they were Palestinian. If they were Jews, they would have been given free housing and an Israeli passport, but they weren't. They were Palestinians. And as soon as you realize that the only reason they were shot at and killed mercilessly is because they were Palestinians, that had they been Jewish, they would have been welcome, you realize how rotten the idea of a Jewish state is, because it gave legal cover to the act of firing on someone for trying to return to his or her home after a war. And so I went down the history rabbit hole. In my case, that led me to do a PhD in Palestinian history. And so my dissertation was about the origins of a Palestinian identity in the Ottoman period. Personally, I got interested in the topic because you find all these Israel aficionados talking about how Yasser Arafat first propagated a Palestinian identity in the 1960s. And when you encounter myths circulating far and wide, myths as patently false as 2 + 2 = 5, you want to dig deeper. And so the more I studied the history of Israel-Palestine, the more obvious it became that Zionism and Israel have a very dark underbelly. And I say underbelly because Israel desperately tries to hide it, to cover it up, to reclassify files that have been exposed from the archives, to ban international activists, to deny permits, to revoke residency status, to destroy the buildings of journalists in Gaza. And so Israel is actively trying to hide its expulsions, its siege, its occupations. It's trying to hide its apartheid as much as possible. And when you study the history, you also realize that Israel exists in the first place because of the brute force of colonialism. Israel exists because the native inhabitants were never given a say over who gets to rule over them. Actually, that's not entirely true. They were given a say. In 1918, the people of Palestine were surveyed. This was shortly after the British took over Palestine in 1917, and a delegation of Americans arrived to survey public opinion in the spirit of democracy. This was in the spirit of Woodrow Wilson's 14-point speech. And so you had this commission, the King-Crank Commission, and they asked people, do you support establishing a national homeland for the Jews in Palestine? 5.7% supported Zionism. 85% opposed Zionism. And the British were like, yo, let's go with the 5.7%. And so over the course of the next 30 years, the British appointed itself as guarantor of the will of the 5.7% against the will of the 85%. And it was that brute force of colonialism that gave rise to a Jewish state in Palestine. And that's when you get a sense of the injustice felt on the Palestinian side. And so I do think history is interesting and important, but it's not the most important issue in understanding why I personally became an anti-Zionist. The real issue for me is about legitimacy, and it's about the source of political legitimacy. What gives a government the legitimate right to rule? Governments need to convince all of us that we should voluntarily submit ourselves to them, that we should voluntarily abide by their laws and pay our taxes and obtain the permits and respect public ordinances and potentially even come to defend the government if need be. And that's the ultimate thing that will make a government successful and prosperous. Legitimacy, when people believe in it. And the key question that Israelis and Palestinians need to ask themselves is, what kind of government will succeed in winning over the legitimacy of everyone? And I think just like in a basketball game, the referee cannot be perceived to take one side or the other. And just like in a court of law, the judge cannot accept a bribe from one party or the other. And just like in couples therapy, a counselor cannot be perceived to be allied with one person over the other. The same is true in Israel-Palestine. The only government that will win over the legitimacy of everyone in Israel and Palestine will be a government that favors neither Jews nor Palestinians, but rather a government that guarantees the rights of both communities first, but more importantly, that guarantees the rights of individuals as individuals before all else.